Hi, and welcome to the second video in Diversity and Evolution of Insects. What I want to talk about today is to focus on one of the fundamental concepts in biology, using terms that we frankly we use all the time, and we've already used it several times in this course, and that is the idea of a species. It's something that is so deeply ingrained in our vocabulary, even in common everyday language, that we usually don't think too much about what it means. And in fact, it's proven to be a bit of a bugaboo um, in biology, in that given the great diversity in the biological world, it's been very difficult to come down with a single definition or a single concept that encompasses what exactly a species is. And so I want to explore that a bit today, just so that we can see what this concept is based upon. So for readings for today, I actually posted three things, but before I get to that, I noticed that when I was making up this slide that I hadn't given you the full citation for the Stork et al. Paper, so I've given the full citation there, although you could glean it from the PDF. But the readings for today, there was one by Kevin DeCaros, also published in PNAS, on a unified concept of species. And then an article by John Wilkins that is probably a little bit easier to read, talking about the same subject. And in addition, a glossary that he put together to explain what the many different kinds of species concepts there are out there actually mean. So in terms of discussing these papers, I'm going to concentrate on the DeCaros article, and not so much on the Wilkins article. I think it gives a nice complement to DeCaros. But before we get into that, I think it's probably be useful and perhaps review for some of you, just take a step back and think about how we got to the point where DeCaros's article actually has some value. So the word species, actually, of course, it's a native English word, and it has lots of meanings, and it had meaning well before it was ever used in any modern biological sort of context. According to Merriam-Webster, the word ultimately comes from the Latin for appearance or kind in the sense of a sort of thing, and not kind as in an emotional I'm being kind to you, that kind of thing. So appearance or kind. Then it ultimately comes from the verb specere, meaning to look. So, words like spectacle come from that. One thing I do want to warn you about, and that is an idiosyncrasy in the English language, in that we use the word species in both the singular, for both singular and plural. That is, species can be either singular or plural. This is not true in other languages that have plurals. Things like Chinese don't have plurals, except in the case of people sometimes. But in other languages like German, the word art means species, and then the plural of that is arten. In Russian, vid and vidi, and in French, espèce, espèce. You don't really hear it so much when you say it, but also, Spanish, especie, especies, and Portuguese, and all these Romance languages, there are distinct plural forms. There is a word in English, specie, which looks like it should be the singular, and actually my iPhone's Merriam-Webster dictionary app actually suggests that some people do use specie as the singular form of species, but that's actually not correct. In that form, specie, it actually has a very distinct meaning, although it has the same etymology, meaning money in the form of coins. So if you see somebody who needs specie. It actually needs money. But in its normal sense, at its core, I guess, the word species is talking about a fundamental observation that is apparent to anybody who lives in the natural world, certainly to humans from time immemorial. And that is that if you look at the natural world, you see that there are different kinds of things out there. There are cattails, there are dragonflies, there are elephants. These things are different, and these are referred to as being different species. And so that's ultimately where the word comes from. But that's not a rigorous biological definition. So let's see if we can work our way toward at least a little bit more rigor when we use that term. So I like to take examples that are pretty obvious, and I like to go bird watching. I'm not very good at it, but I like to get out and take binoculars with me and take a look at birds. And if you've ever been down in the southeast, you'll see a number of these species. There, I used the word. A number of these birds that I'm going to show you. So here's an obvious example. This frankly ridiculous looking creature is called the roseate spoonbill, and you can see from the shape of its bill why it gets that name, and also you can see from the color of feathers why it gets the adjective attached to it, roseate, for this pinkish reddish color that they have. If you see spoonbills, for example, in Australia, they're kind of a overall dirty white. So there's lots of variation among different kinds. I'm trying to be careful of my language here, of spoonbills. But in the U.S., I'm not sure about if there are other kinds of spoonbills down in South America. So let's just restrict it to the U.S. The only spoonbill we have is this thing called a roseate spoonbill. Very distinctive. You would never confuse this bird with these other two birds that you see there. Those are called wood storks. The wood storks are, gosh, there's so many differences. They're significantly larger. The difference in size is belied a bit by the angle at which this photograph is taken. You can see a difference in the shape of the bill. The stork's bill comes to a point and it's down curved, as opposed to the spoonbill's bill, which is apically expanded. That's where it gets its name, of course. And the storks, you can see that the primary feathers, and are those the secondaries? I've forgotten my bird anatomy. The secondary feathers there are black, whereas most of the rest of the feathers on the body are white. And there's all sorts of other differences in terms between these animals. So here we clearly have two different kinds of birds. The wood stork on the one hand, the roseate spoonbill on the other, and we can talk about them being different species. So I've basically now given you one example of a species concept by which I'm distinguishing these things. I see two different kinds of birds here, and I can enumerate a whole series of characteristics by which they differ. And so I'm differentiating them into two different things entirely. Let's take another look, another bird. Here's another long-legged wader. Well, not always a wader, but in this particular image you can see they are. And I don't think anybody would confuse these birds with the wood storks or the spoonbills from the last slide. These, of course, are sandhill cranes. Long legs, sharply pointed bill, but look at all the differences. The crown, the red eye, the white chin, the overall gray color. These things are very different birds. So we can start, on the first cut, we can start dividing the natural world into these different kinds based upon these features that are apparent to us as humans. And remember, this is us as humans using the sensory equipment that we are supplied with in order to distinguish things out there in the real world. All right, so let's throw in a complication. Beautiful duck, isn't it? This is a northern pintail. There are several species of pintails. I guess I'm going to feel free to use the word species from this point on. There are several species of pintails around the world. This is the species that is characteristic of North America. And you can see how this animal gets both its common and scientific name. The genus Anas are ducks, and so things like mallards and black ducks and all the different species of ducks, not all, but many of the different species of dabbling ducks belong to that genus. And acuta means sharply pointed, and just as the name pintail means pointed. You can see in the male those long feathers coming off the tail that give it its common name. So no confusion there with roseate spoonbill, wood stork, sandhill crane. That's a different animal. That's a different species. But what about this? I'm probably already given the game away in that I referred in that last slide to that you could see in this male. Here we have another pintail there on the left that looks very similar, nearly identical to the one I just showed you. But the bird on the right looks fundamentally different. You can make a whole long list of characteristics that differ. It doesn't have the white stripe going up the side of the head. It's got this mottled brown color over it. It doesn't have the very elongate tail feathers. It doesn't have that black speculum, this black bar here. Notice how these feathers are over long and overlapping here. Those are two fundamentally different looking animals. Are they two different species? As I said, I've given the game away because this is the male pintail and this is a female pintail. So it's just common sense, right? Everybody knows this, that very often two sexes of an organism will differ in not only the primary sexual characters such as the genitalia, the reproductive organs, and that kind of stuff, but in secondary sexual characters, in this case, the plumage of these birds. And so our species concept has to be able to expand beyond simply saying a species is two. We differentiate between species because they look different, because here obviously we have two organisms that look very different and yet they're the same. So our species concept has to be able to encompass this idea of sexual dimorphism, a differentiation between the sexes. We need to go a little bit further though, because this is just as much a pintail as we saw in the earlier picture. Except this is a different developmental stage of that animal, and that's the egg stage. And so the basic point that I'm trying to get here is that our species concept cannot be based solely upon empirically observable differences, but it has to take into consideration differences between the sexes, differences in the ontogenetic stage, where there's egg, or in the case of something like this Culex mosquito, adults, eggs, larvae. They look very different. I didn't put a picture of the pupa up there, but it also looks different. You have different instars in the larvae that are slightly different in size, and in many insects they will be, even those instars will be different from one another, at the very least in their proportions and overall size. All of this variation in structure is inherent within a single species. No one would argue that the egg stage is a different species than the larval stage is a different species than the adult stage. These are all manifestations of the same organism, the same species. And so our species concept has to be able to encompass that, to incorporate that into it. Now that seems all pretty obvious, right? I mean, people have known this from time immemorial, that the world is, well, there are some people who entertain the question of whether the species are real or not. I think un, um, I'm struggling for the word, without reservation, unreservedly, would come to the conclusion that everything that we see around us, all the living things, are not the same. There are different kinds of things. And in that sense, there are, in fact, different species. There are bacteria, there are trees, there are elephants and rhinoceroses and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. So species, in some sense, are real in that the biological world is just not a continuum, at least when we talk about multicellular organisms. I think once you get into things like bacteria, maybe all bets are off, and we have to really think fundamentally about what divides bacteria into different kinds, if anything does. But at least in the multicellular organisms, that species are real. And if we're going to define a species, we have to define it on something a little bit more, or maybe a lot more, than just that they look different to us. As we've seen, we have to encompass differences between the sexes, different developmental stages. We also have to encompass the idea that species can vary geographically, that the same thing in one part of the world may look very different from the same thing in another part of the world. To give you an example of that, here's my last example from birds. We have what's now called the dark-eyed junco, Junco hyemalis. So when I first started learning birds, back when I was a teenager, I guess, these two things, and actually there are more that fit into this same, under the same name, dark-eyed junco, but these are two extremes. The one on the left-hand side was called the slate-colored junco, and this is a species that's very common in the East. Well, shouldn't call it a species. The slate-colored junco is very common in the East. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I've got some out in my backyard right now because they migrate south to Ohio and the northern part of the United States from much farther north in Canada and the fringes of the northern United States to overwinter. Very common bird. You can see how it gets that common name, slate-colored junco, because of this rich gray color. Males and females are pretty much the same. The females are a little less. The contrast between the gray and the white of the body is a little bit less striking, so the gray is not quite so intense. And then the bird on the right, as I said, when I was growing up, of course I was living in the East, so I never saw these live until much later, is something called the Oregon junco. And you can make a long list of just on the color of the plumage here of how that bird differs from the slate-colored junco. The black head, the brown, almost a chestnut color of the flanks, the brown upper coverts, the back. It has the same. If you're a bird watcher, you know that this junco has white outer tail feathers, and you kind of see that indication right there, and also right here. It's much more apparent when they're flying. But they also differ in their song. The very distinctively different songs. But ornithologists today treat these two things as just different geographic variants of the same fundamental species, the dark-eyed junco. If you only looked at the two in isolation, you would probably come to the reasonable conclusion that those are two different species. But when you look at it across the geographic range, you see a great deal more variation and a great deal more intergradation between these two color forms across that area. And so actually what we're seeing are manifestations of geographic variation in this animal. So this idea that we have to incorporate variation into our concept of species is something very fundamental. Okay, so I was doing a little background work, seeing how other people teach the idea of species concepts, and most courses that at least put their materials online seem to go into a fair amount of detail about all of the different species concepts that are out there. And by concept, basically what I'm talking about is uh, the idea of a definition of what a species is. Um, Almost universally, they start out talking about what is called a typological species concept, and then as you saw in your readings, there are many more species concepts that have developed since then, and I'm not going to try to cover them all. There were at least 24 different ones. It just depends on how you want to slice up that pie as to how many different species concepts there are out there in the world. But the idea of a typological species concept is a very old one, and one that survived well into, I would say well into the 19th century in science, and has only relatively recently been supplanted by other ideas. Now, the typological species concept, I'll come back to this at the end of this video, but it's kind of a misunderstood concept. It's often stated that the earliest natural historians, people like Linnaeus, were the originators of the typological species concept, and in fact, Linnaeus based his classification on the assumption, classification of plants, that is, on the assumption that the organs involved in sexual reproduction would be the keys to understanding how the different species of plants were interrelated and what constituted a species in a plant. If they had different anthers and different flowers, then they would be different species. But actually, this idea goes much farther back than Linnaeus in the 1750s or the 1730s, when he published on his big books on the plants. And in some ways, it can be traced back to ancient Greek philosophy and the so-called Platonic ideal, or the essence of things. So a common example that people use to describe what this idea means is to say, well, we can go out, I can look out my window here, you can't see, but I can, and there's a hackberry tree right in front of me. It must be about, I would say about 30 feet high. But then over there in my neighbor's yard, I see a Norway spruce, another tree, but looks very different. At this time of year, it has leaves on it, and it has the boughs hanging and the short needles. And then over there's a yew tree, forming a scraggly border between our houses. I know he's got over there's a big sycamore tree that every time there's a windstorm, a huge branch comes down. All of these things look very different. The Norway spruce, the hackberry, the yew, the sycamore over there. And yet, in some sense, we're all very comfortable, I think, saying that those are all trees. They're large, or relatively large, woody plants. What else goes into defining a tree? It's a single organism out there. And so the idea of this Platonic ideal, or this essence of things, is the same way we have a tree. We can look at different individual trees and point out all sorts of differences, and yet somewhere in our heads we have why do we call them all trees? It's because there's something they all have in common, or some things that they all have in common that make them trees to us. And so the idea here is that what we see in the real world are various imperfect manifestations of the idealized essence of what a tree is. That yew is pretty scraggly, it's not too big, but it's big enough to be called a tree. And so what's out there is, as I said, an imperfect manifestation of the core essence of a tree. And so many people also think of species in that sense, is that when we look at different juncos and we see this one's gray and this one's brown with a black head, they're all at their core a junco, and what we're seeing are different ways of that junco-ness, it's not a word, but I made it up, being expressed in the individuals. And so this is a very, very old idea. That's supposed to be a bust of Plato, but obviously he died long before the bust was made. So to jump ahead a couple of hundred years from that sort of Linnaean typological species concept. Oh, I should make clear what I mean by typological, or at least reduce some confusion about that. By typological, I don't mean that, well, what some people I've seen on the web saying is that typological species concept is based upon identifying things by comparing them with their types. In the Platonic ideal, you can't personally sense that type. You cannot go see where the essence of trees are. You have it somehow, or you infer it from the different manifestations you see. We'll talk about types when we talk about nomenclature, about the naming system for species. And the use of the word type is actually, I think, in many ways very unfortunate. It implies things like the idea of something being typical in the sense of normal or something like that. But actually, this common English word is carrying a lot of epistemological baggage along with it. So the Linnaean idea, commonly characterized or maybe caricatured, is that species are defined by being different. And we've seen how we have to massage that definition a little bit. Okay, now to jump ahead to what you will usually see if you're TAing general biology or trying to teach general biology, is that a species is usually defined something along the lines of a species as a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations. And then there often caveats are thrown in there, but this is the real core. The core word here is interbreeding. And then ancillary ones are actually, potentially, and natural populations. This is the so-called biological species concept. As who was it? De Queiroz said that, well, practically all of our species concepts, in that we're talking about biological entities, are biological in some sense. But this is the one that's normally called the biological species concept, and the focus on interbreeding. So where did this idea come from? Let's take a step back to the early, I would say 1930s, 1940s, about where this idea developed. So this is the man from the title of De Queiroz's article. Actually, the subject of that article, De Queiroz, is published in several different places, and that paper in PNAS actually came out of an invitation for him to speak on the subject. But he talks about about this man, Ernst Mayr. Mayr was an ornithologist who worked at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. If you're not familiar, the Museum of Comparative Zoology is at Harvard University. That's on the picture on the left. You see Mayr with his local guide in 1928, in the midst of a months-long survey of birds in New Guinea. So Mayr was very interested in birds and studying the different species of birds. And so his concepts about species are rooted in the fact that he was a vertebrate biologist, an ornithologist. De Queiroz makes a little side swipe there, talking about how Mayr got the last word because of how long he lived. You can see there that he lived to be over 100 years old. Quite an eminent scientist, quite vocal, quite opinionated, and quite willing to engage in the back and forth of scientific polemics during his years. He was actually given an award very late in his life, which he then proved that he was the best taxonomist in the world because he had been given this award. I think, well, he deserved lots of accolades by virtue of the influence that his work had. You saw some of the titles of the books that he published in de Queiros's article. That was one of those books, Animal Species and Evolution, I believe it was my textbook for insect systematics way back in the day when I was taking a course as an undergraduate. 2-inch thick book, dull reading. Anyway, let me introduce you to some other characters that de Queiros talks about. This is George Gaylord Simpson. Like Meyer, Simpson was a vertebrate biologist, but Simpson was actually, well, he focused on mammals, and he was also a paleontologist largely. Probably one of his most famous books was called Tempo and Mode in Evolution. So you see he's adding another dimension to the whole question, whereas Meyer was focused upon the modern avifauna and then an extension to all modern animals. Simpson, as a paleontologist, incorporated the idea of time into this. And you can see that in the title of the book, the tempo, so the rate of evolution, in addition to how evolution occurs, its mode. He was, for most of his career, in the eastern U.S., working at Columbia University, which of course is in New York City, as is the American Museum of Natural History. He had I think it was a shared appointment with the Museum of Comparative Zoology there in Cambridge, Mass. And toward the end of his life, he moved out to Arizona to take a position there. You can see he also lived to a ripe old age and was also very influential in this field and in the development of the ideas of what a species is and how species evolve. The last person I want to mention is Dobzhansky, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who, you know, my memory fails me now whether he was Russian or Ukrainian, but he definitely came out of what ultimately became the Soviet Union, born at the turn of the century. He was quite a different sort of scientist. He was fundamentally interested in Drosophila genetics. And so he, from his experiences working with Drosophila, published a very influential book called Genetics and the Origin of Species. And you can see that originally he was employed at Columbia University in New York, and then later moved out west to Caltech. And he is the person who uttered the famous aphorism that nothing in evolution makes sense except, I'm sorry, that's wrong. That should say nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So get rid of that first evolution. That should be biology. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So these are three of the leading lights of the time. And this time was something that de Queiros in his article refers to as the modern evolutionary synthesis. Now, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with what this term actually refers to. So it's actually making reference to I've called it a marriage here, or the intersection of Darwinian evolution, what we understood about Darwinian evolution by natural selection, with the recently rediscovered principles of Mendelian genetics. So remember that Darwin's work actually predated Mendel's work, and so Darwin really didn't know anything about the details of how things were inherited, although the core of his theory of natural selection was based upon the inheritance of these features that endowed their holders with increased fitness. Mendelian genetics, as you know, disappeared for many years and was only rediscovered early in the 20th century. And what they call the modern evolutionary synthesis was the bringing together of these two seemingly disparate ideas to imbue Darwinian natural selection with what we understood about what we then were learning and coming to understand about how traits were actually inherited, usually very simple traits, but to bring these two things together. And so this was a revolutionary period in biology. One of the things that this all meant was, in terms of development of a species concept, was that the idea of variation was not something as in a Platonic ideal that you overlook the variation in order to understand the underlying essence. No, the variation itself is the core of what's important in evolution. That we can't have evolution without variation. If everything is the same, then how's it going to change? The source of change, which is what evolution is the variation within populations. And so I guess you could also say populations are also an inherent part of this. And so it was a change in the focus from trying to ignore variation to focusing on the variation. In the biological species concept, it's often claimed that the species, well, let's take a step back. In a classification, the species is one rank of several in a formal classification. The highest level usually, well, it's changing these days, but often the highest level is called the kingdom, and then we work our way through the hierarchy and we end up down at the species level, and maybe we can even go a little bit farther below the species level. We'll talk about classifications and what these ranks mean in a little bit, not in this video, but before too long we'll get into that. But of all of those ranks, you probably have a mnemonic in your head, like King Philip came over from Greece on a ship. So kingdom, phylum, order came over from family, genus, species. Of all of those ranks, that the species stands out because rather than simply being a conglomeration of other things that we group together for convenience sake, that the species is actually something fundamentally different, that it is defined objectively and not subjectively. And that objective definition, if you think back to what the biological species concept was based upon the ability of members of a species to interbreed. Not only the physical act of mating, but also the production of fertile offspring as a result of that mating. So the species was thought to be something very fundamentally different and objectively defined. One way of thinking about it, kind of the way I've thought about it, is that it's a fundamental unit of evolution. That a genus, which is a group of species, the genus itself doesn't evolve. The species within it evolve. An individual within a species doesn't evolve, but the individuals that form a species, the species evolves through time. So that's our unit of evolution. And that barring things like hybridization, horizontal gene transfer, et cetera, all these ways of transfection, if you will, of one species of another with DNA, that a species is an isolated gene pool, an isolated reproductive community, free to independently evolve without the direct influence of the DNA of other species with which it might live. Of course, there are many and widely recognized problems with the biological species concept. Just to reiterate, a species is a population or group of populations, the members of which can freely interbreed under natural conditions. Another formulation of that. So the core of this is that it's the ability of members of the same species to interbreed and their inability to interbreed with other species. So this emphasis on interbreeding means that this concept, this definition, is restricted to organisms that have sexual reproduction. I haven't thought it through, but maybe it's even, I don't think it's necessarily restricted to organisms with only two sexes. So some of the protists with multiple quote unquote mating strains, you can have more than two sexes, but they need to interbreed. So that eliminates from consideration asexual or parthenogenetic organisms, that is, organisms in which the eggs develop into adults without ever being fertilized, either because they can develop as a haploid organism or because there's some mechanism by which the chromosomal complement is intrinsically doubled and without the eggs being fertilized by spermatozoa. I guess it also eliminates from consideration hermaphrodites or self-fertilizing organisms that have both male and female reproductive structures with which they can self-fertilize. So we've got to cut these out of the equation. Then we get into all sorts of problems. How do you, what does it mean? The definition says actual or potentially interbreeding organisms. What does potential mean? Well, you could have two organisms separated by 1,000 miles. If you bring them together, they may be able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. Does that mean they're the same species? Well, maybe. But on the other hand, there are things, I put ligers and tiglons there as an example. If you can take a lion and a tiger, and they are capable, under the right conditions, who knows what they are, of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. And depending on which sex is male, which individual is male, which individual is female, they're referred to as ligers or tiglons. Does that mean that lions and tigers are actually the same species? No. You can go back. Today, the geographic range in which lions and tigers occur are largely allopatric. That you think of lions in Africa and tigers in India, east to Siberia, and south into Southeast Asia. But that's not the historical distribution. Matter of fact, it's not even the true actual distributions of lions and tigers. There are native lion populations in Western India. And of course, both species were much more widespread, hundreds, thousands of years ago. And in all that time, no one ever discovered a hybrid of lions and tigers. In other words, that under natural conditions that these organisms occur, they don't interbreed. There are all sorts of behavioral differences between these two species, habitat differences between them that would inhibit interbreeding, even though physiologically, genetically, they are capable of interbreeding and producing viable offspring. So how do you know that something can't or doesn't interbreed under natural conditions? It's often very, very difficult to determine this. If you bring them into the laboratory, you're putting them in, by definition, unnatural conditions. And so the fact that the two things that look different might be able to interbreed under those conditions does not really get to the question of whether they would interbreed in nature. Then we get to the idea of, is this definition actually operational? And by operational, I mean, can it be used in the real world to accomplish anything? Or is it just an airy-fairy idea that we can't really apply in the real world? Another couple of other authors that were cited in DeCaro's article were Sokol and Crivello, and this point about operationalism refers to, well, they made a big point about it. We'll meet Robert Sokol again later in this course, He was a mathematician slash statistician, did a lot of groundbreaking work at the University of Kansas. And Ted Crivello was a bacteriologist. And so as a bacteriologist, he was rightfully pretty skeptical that the concepts that Meyer and Dobzhansky and Simpson were developing were universal, that they could be applied to his bacteria, where you saw all sorts of horizontal gene transfer going on. But one of the criticisms they made about the operationality, is that a word, of the biological species concept, was that, in fact, we very rarely even bother to try what would be the core test of whether two things are different species or not, to see if they could interbreed. It's difficult even in the best of circumstances, but how would you even test whether an oak tree can interbreed with a woodpecker or something like that? They're so fundamentally different organisms that trying to apply a criterion of interbreeding between the two is impossible. And then finally, Simpson introduced the idea of time. Well, not introduced, but he emphasized the idea of putting a time dimension to our consideration of the evolution of species. So how do we deal with the fossil record, with extinct organisms? By definition, if they're extinct, we cannot observe whether or not two dinosaurs belong to the same species or not on the basis of whether or not they could or could not interbreed. They're dead. They're gone. We can't do this. And so we're constrained to just looking at the evidence that we have left in the fossil record. And even in our wildest dreams, we've only made very little progress on actually sequencing getting any kind of characters other than the morphological remnants, save maybe some extinct woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and things that have been frozen in Siberian tundra for tens of thousands of years. Most extinct organisms, we just cannot apply the biological species concept. So what do we do? So this brings us, I'm not going to go into all of the other various species concepts. They talk about many of them: phylogenetic species concept, ecological species concept, the recognition species concept. All of these are using different criteria to distinguish among organisms and to tell whether or not they're the same species or not. Do they differ in ecological niche? That would be an ecological species concept. Are they different belonging to different monophyletic groups? We'll get into that terminology later, but that would be one of the phylogenetic species concepts. Do they not interbreed because they don't recognize each other as mates? A recognition species concept. Dozens of different species concept. Not a small amount of ego probably going into people differentiating their ideas from those of their predecessors. What De Queiroz makes a couple of important points. I don't think any of these things were particularly earth-shaking in terms of people hadn't thought of them, at least implicitly, before. I know they struck a chord with me, in that these are some things that seem straightforward to me. But he defines, well, I guess I'm gonna jump ahead here on this slide a little bit. He makes a differentiation between what a species is and how do we tell whether a species is different or not. And his point is that there's been a lot of confusion or commingling of those two ideas, of a concept and the evidence for that concept, and putting them together in a way that is not necessary. His definition of species is fundamentally what he calls the metapopulation. A species is a metapopulation lineage. So a metapopulation is nothing more than a population of populations. So where these populations can be more or less physically separated. Same way, metadata is data about data. So a metapopulation is a group of populations. And then the intention of using the word lineage is to incorporate that dimension of time, is that they exist through time. And it's a bit redundant if you think about it, since he defines a lineage as metapopulations through time. So metapopulation lineages is a little bit redundant. So if that's what a species is, it does kind of beg the question of how do we recognize that different species, how do we recognize different species? How do we know that two things that seem to be, that might be different metapopulation lineages are actually that? And in this, I want to make sure to, he makes extensive use of the adjective contingent in describing the attributes that have been associated with species concept. So in the case of the biological species concept, what De Queiroz claims is a contingent attribute of that concept is that species can interbreed within and cannot interbreed with things in other species. I personally usually kind of think of something that's contingent means that if A is contingent on B, it means that A depends upon B. A cannot occur unless B occurs. But he's using the word contingent in a very different sense. And the sense is that an attribute that is contingent means that this attribute is not necessarily observed in a particular case. So we could have species, two different species, for which the contingent attribute of not being able to interbreed is actually not true. We don't require, or let's put it this way, we need not require an inability to interbreed in order to posit that two populations belong to different species. And he makes the point. He puts it he uses the not metaphor, but kind of a parallel of an organism developing through time. That an organism needs to reproduce, but the earliest developmental stages can't reproduce. They develop that ability later. And so in the same way, species can develop through time and gain all of these contingent attributes that are associated with these different species concepts. They gain, I guess, lose the ability to interbreed with other such organisms. They get into a different ecological niche, and so they are distinct ecologically from other organisms. They learn to recognize their mates and not recognize others as mates. All of the characteristics, morphology, they become different in bill shape, leg length, color of the plumage, all of these things. These are all hints that the populations we're looking at belong to different species, belong to different lineages, but no one of them is by definition any more important than another. And in fact, these things are acquired through time. So we should expect to find nascent species coming into being where they have acquired maybe some attributes that separate their gene pools such that they're not exchanging DNA, but maybe not all, and maybe only certain conditions. So we should expect to observe species coming into being and not be completely differentiated. The easiest examples are like those birds. The birds are easy because obviously they have been differentiated for a long period of time, and also birds rely upon many of the same senses that we rely upon, sight and hearing, and so we can see the colors and songs. We're using the same characteristics that they use in order to find mates and to breed. So this is a very, I think the important point here is the differentiation or the separation of the evidence that's used for to test whether or not two things are the same species, and the definition of what a species is, to separate these two. And so he believes that he has now provided a way to unify all the disparate species concepts that have been out there historically. Okay, just to circle back in the last few minutes here to this, to some fallacies, and I think are fallacies. We often see something called a morphospecies or a morphospecies concept. And this is particularly common these days when people are doing, large-scale biological surveys, and they need to get the organisms that they've collected to get them identified. They'll often say that, well, I'm using a morphospecies concept, which basically means they're going in and looking to see what's different. What are the various kinds? And in a sense, this sounds like we're retreating back to the idea of what species were from the 1750s, before Darwinian evolution, before the modern evolutionary synthesis, before everything we've learned about DNA and biology and inheritance in the hundreds of years since then. Then it's actually taking a backwards step. So, as I say, the idea, the morphospecies concept, is often, I think, erroneously equated with the typological species concept. Remember your Platonic ideal. And although the word morpho is in there, morphospecies, I think it's erroneous to assume that a morphospecies concept is necessarily based on morphology. In one way of thinking, a DNA sequence is exactly the same as morphology. It's an expression of the genome of the animal. It is the genome in many cases. But we come to the question, two things look differently. Do they look differently enough to be two different species? Two things have different DNA sequences. Are the DNA sequences enough to conclude that they're different species? So in a sense, they're the same. And this leads to another erroneous conclusion. I feel like I'm being a little bit self-defensive here, but that taxonomists who study, try to find what species are out there in the world, to how to recognize them, how to differentiate them. Taxonomists that are using morphology are actually doing very backwards 19th century, flawed 19th century pseudoscience. That, why aren't you using the latest techniques? You're using morphology. Everybody knows morphology isn't worth anything. But morphology, the same as any characteristic, is the same as any characteristic that you would use to try to differentiate organisms. One needs to be able to distinguish between heritable variation. That heritable variation might be in structure, might be in DNA sequence, might be in behavior, song, anything. Differentiate between what is heritable and what is environmental, induced by the environmental, occurs just by chance. So there are different sources of variation. Some variation is heritable, and that's what the core is. Some is not. Ecotypes in plants, that a plant grown in the far north will have a different structure and morphology than a plant grown farther south. Fundamentally, I think we're going back to de Queiros's distinction between what the concept is and what the evidence is used. Morphology is just as valuable, at least has the same potential to be of value in distinguishing and recognizing species as anything else. And so one can, and one probably ideally would, study a group in greater and greater detail, beginning with morphology, because that's relatively easily accessible, and then getting into things like DNA sequences, DNA expression, behavior, all of these other things to look more and more closely at a set of species hypotheses, and at their core, these are hypotheses, and trying to see if how the other evidence relates to those hypotheses. Do they support the hypothesis? Do they falsify the hypothesis? So I'm a defender of using morphology for species recognition. So just a quick summary. E pluribus unum, from 24, 26 different species concepts. I think we now see the way forward to a unified species concept, which gets back to that idea that a species is the fundamental unit of evolution. That's what we're interested in. And that concept, as defined by de Queiroz, is, or as encapsulated by de Queiroz, is that a species is a metapopulation lineage. We need to differentiate between the definitions of these concepts and the evidence that we use to apply in a particular case to see if a population meets those or a set of populations meets those definitions. Do we have one species? Do we have many species? And in this sense, all data is good data. All data also has bad, there's bad data and everything as well. So we need to differentiate between that heritable component. That's the part we're interested in, and the part that is, dare I say it, contingent. And this can come from morphology, physiology, behavior, sequencing, anything. Anything is fair game. And then finally, I guess I've already said this, is that the species at its core is the fundamental unit of evolution. Groups of species can be put in a taxonomic hierarchy, and we'll talk about how we do that and what we can do in order to try to define those things a little bit more rigorously. But basically, the only thing that approaches an objective definition, and that is not simply a subjective preference of an individual studying the group, is the species. So all of that kind of begs the question, and this is where we're going to go in the next video, is to ask the question that was encapsulated in Darwin's book on the origin of species. Where do species come from? And that'll be the subject of the next video. Till then, thanks, and take care.